Have you ever wondered what secrets soldiers carry with them into battle? Secrets so dangerous that discovering them could change the fate of nations? What if I told you that a simple leather pouch, worn and blood-stained, found on a dying man in the mud of a forgotten battlefield, contained information that would expose the largest espionage network Europe had ever seen? Before we dive into this incredible story, I need your help. Please comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear has been buried in classified archives for decades, and we need your support to continue uncovering the truth. The morning of November 11th, 1918, brought silence to the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. But for Captain Robert Harrison of the American Expeditionary Forces, that silence felt more ominous than any artillery barrage he had endured. Harrison stood in a shattered forest near the Meuse River, watching medics move through the wreckage of what had been, just hours before, a desperate German defensive position. The ground was a nightmare of shell craters, splintered trees, and the debris of war. Smoke still rose from smoldering equipment, the acrid smell of cordite mixed with wet earth and something far worse, the unmistakable stench of death that Harrison had learned to recognize but never accept. His boots squelched in mud as he supervised the collection of intelligence materials from the abandoned trenches. Standard procedure, maps, orders, anything that might prove useful, even though the war had just ended. It was Private James Coleman who found him, a young man from Oklahoma, barely 20 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from too many nights in flooded trenches. Coleman had been assigned to search the bodies of fallen enemy soldiers for documents, a grim but necessary task that nobody volunteered for. "Harrison, sir." Coleman's voice carried an edge that made the captain turn immediately. "You need to see this." The body lay half-submerged in a crater filled with rainwater and blood. The uniform was German, but something about it seemed wrong to Harrison's experienced eye. The cut was too fine, the material too good for a frontline soldier. The man's face, frozen in death, showed features that might have been Slavic or perhaps Mediterranean. Not the typical Prussian or Bavarian features Harrison had grown accustomed to seeing, but it was what Coleman held in his hands that commanded attention. A leather satchel, small enough to fit against a man's chest beneath his tunic, designed to be concealed. The leather was scarred and stained, one corner burned as if someone had tried to destroy it, but failed. 3 brass buckles held it closed, and stamped into the leather near the top was a symbol Harrison didn't recognize at first. A double-headed eagle, but not the German imperial eagle, something older, more ornate. Coleman had already opened it, his hands trembling slightly as he handed it to Harrison. "Sir, I can't read most of this, but the names. There are American names in here, and British, and French." Harrison's throat went dry as he examined the contents. The satchel contained a collection of materials that seemed impossible. Dozens of thin papers, some typed on tissue-thin onion skin, others handwritten in various inks and languages, photographs, small and grainy, showing men in civilian clothes, military uniforms, government buildings, a small ledger with columns of numbers that looked like financial accounts, and maps. Dear God, the maps! They showed military installations, government offices, and private residences across France, Belgium, England, and even the United States. But what froze Harrison's blood were the names, listed in meticulous detail, with addresses, code names, and notations in German, Russian, and what appeared to be Serbian. He recognized some of them. A French colonel who had been killed in an artillery strike 6 months earlier. A British intelligence officer stationed in London. An American State Department official Harrison had once met at a briefing in Paris. And dozens more he didn't know, spanning ranks from enlisted men to high-ranking officials. "Get me Major Whitmore," Harrison said quietly, his command voice barely above a whisper. "Get him now. And Coleman, not a word about this to anyone. Do you understand? Not your tent mates, not the chaplain, not your own mother if she were standing here. This doesn't exist until I say it does." "Yes, sir." Coleman's face had gone pale. He understood enough to know he was holding something that could get a man killed even after the shooting had stopped. Major Theodore Whitmore arrived within the hour, riding hard from division headquarters. Whitmore was Intelligence Corps, a former professor from Yale who spoke 6 languages and had a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanent stoop of someone who spent too much time hunched over documents. But his mind was sharp as any blade. And when Harrison showed him the contents of the satchel, Whitmore's reaction confirmed the captain's worst fears. "Mother of God," Whitmore breathed, his hands hovering over the papers spread across a makeshift table in a ruined farmhouse they had commandeered. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "I was hoping you could tell me, sir." Whitmore picked up one of the photographs, holding it close to his face in the dim light filtering through the broken roof. "This man, he's a banker in Zurich. Swiss neutral territory?" He tapped another photograph. "This one worked at the American embassy in Rome until last year, when he died in what was reported as a streetcar accident." He selected a third image, his hand now visibly shaking. "And this woman, she was a telephone operator at British headquarters in Amiens. She committed suicide 3 months ago. At least, that's what the report said." Harrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Whitmore set down the photographs and picked up the ledger, flipping through pages covered in neat columns of figures. "Captain Harrison, what we're looking at here is evidence of an espionage network that spans all of Europe and reaches into America. The amounts of money documented here, the level of organization, the scope." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with a handkerchief, a nervous gesture Harrison had seen before. "This isn't just German military intelligence. This is something far older and far more sophisticated. The symbol on the satchel, it's associated with certain organizations in the Balkans. Secret societies that have existed for centuries. Groups that played a role in starting this whole damned war." "You mean the assassination in Sarajevo?" "That was just the match that lit the fuse, Captain. But someone had to lay the powder trail. Someone had to want this war to happen." Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And someone had to profit from it." Over the next 3 days, as the world celebrated the armistice, Harrison and Whitmore worked in secret, cataloging everything in the satchel. They requisitioned a secure room in what had been a French mayor's office, posted guards they trusted personally, and told no one else about their discovery. They photographed every document, created careful translations, and began to piece together a picture that neither man wanted to believe. The courier they had found, identified through papers in his uniform as Aleksandar Kovac, had been no ordinary soldier. Born in Serbia, educated in Vienna, fluent in 7 languages, Kovac had been a ghost, moving through the chaos of war, carrying information between agents scattered across a dozen countries. The satchel was his insurance policy, or perhaps his blackmail material, a complete record of an organization that called itself the Kurna Ruka, the Black Hand, though Whitmore suspected that was just one of many names it used. The network had agents in every major capital. They worked as clerks, translators, servants in wealthy households, and low-level officials in government ministries. People no one noticed, no one suspected. They passed information about troop movements, supply routes, diplomatic negotiations, and military technologies. But more than that, they influenced decisions. A word whispered in the right ear, a document that mysteriously disappeared, a crucial telegram delayed by just a few hours. "Look at this," Whitmore said on the 3rd night, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He held up a decoded message. June 1916. Before the Battle of the Somme. This indicates that someone in British headquarters was feeding information about the offensive to the Germans. Timing, location, strength of forces. The Germans were waiting for them, Robert. They knew they were coming. Harrison thought of the Somme. 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone. Boys from Manchester and London and Glasgow, mowed down by machine guns that were waiting in exactly the right positions. His stomach turned. How many died because of this? We'll probably never know the full count. Whitmore gathered the papers carefully, as if they might contaminate him. But it's not just about the war. Look at these financial records. Money moving from banks in Switzerland to accounts in New York, London, Paris, investments in steel mills, chemical factories, ammunition manufacturers. Someone was profiting enormously from this war, from both sides. They sold secrets to the Germans, then turned around and sold different secrets to the Allies. They weren't loyal to any nation. They were loyal only to profit and power. The deeper they dug, the worse it became. They found evidence of at least 3 assassination attempts that had succeeded. Targets who had gotten too close to discovering the network. They found records of blackmail operations targeting high-ranking officials, using personal scandals to ensure cooperation. They found lists of journalists and editors who could be relied upon to print or suppress certain stories. And they found something that chilled Harrison to his core, a reference to plans that extended beyond the war's end. The network wasn't planning to disband with peace. It was planning to expand. On the 4th day, Harrison was summoned to meet with a colonel he had never heard of before, a man named Richard Ashford, who arrived from Paris in a staff car with drawn curtains and an escort of military police. Ashford was British, attached to some intelligence unit whose name was never mentioned. He was older, perhaps 50, with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from having seen too much to be easily shocked. Major Whitmore sent word through certain channels. Ashford said without preamble, sitting across from Harrison in the secured room, "He indicated that you've stumbled onto something rather significant. I'm here to determine what needs to be done about it." Harrison bristled at the casual tone. "Colonel, with respect, we haven't stumbled onto anything. We've uncovered evidence of a massive espionage operation that has probably cost thousands of Allied lives. This needs to be investigated fully, publicly if necessary." Ashford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Captain, you're young, and you still believe in justice being served openly. That's admirable. It's also naive." He leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you. The war is over. The world is exhausted, traumatized, desperate for peace and normalcy. What do you think would happen if we announced that there was a vast conspiracy operating throughout the war, that it reached into the highest levels of multiple governments, that some of the men making decisions about where to send soldiers to die were compromised? The truth should come out," Harrison said, but even as he spoke, he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "The truth," Ashford said slowly, "would destroy what little faith people still have in their institutions. It would start investigations that could cripple governments already barely holding together. It would create suspicion between allied nations just when we need to work together to rebuild Europe. And most dangerously, it would alert the members of this network that we know about them, causing them to disappear before we can properly identify and neutralize them." He paused. "Is that what you want, Captain? Chaos and the guilty escaping?" Harrison looked at Whitmore, who had been silent during this exchange. The Major's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes conveyed a message. "This is bigger than us. This is out of our hands." "What are you proposing, Colonel?" Harrison asked finally. Ashford pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. "I'm proposing that this investigation continues, but quietly, very quietly. A small group of trusted individuals will spend the next several years tracking down every person named in those documents. every connection, every financial trail. We'll work with our French allies and with American intelligence services, but it will be done in the shadows, not in the newspapers. And when we've built our case, when we've identified everyone involved, then justice will be served. Quiet justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. And if we refuse, Harrison asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Then you're relieved of duty and sent home, the evidence is confiscated, and someone else has this conversation with Major Whitmore. Ashford's voice was matter-of-fact. You seem like good men, and good men are in short supply. I'm hoping you'll choose to be part of the solution rather than becoming part of the problem. Harrison thought of Private Coleman, who had found the satchel. What about the soldier who discovered this? Does he need to be silenced? He'll be reassigned to a unit shipping home next week, given a promotion and a medal for bravery in combat, and strongly encouraged to focus on building his civilian life rather than dwelling on the war. Ashford closed his portfolio. No one will be harmed, Captain. They'll simply be redirected toward more productive pursuits. It was a polite way of saying Coleman would be watched, probably for the rest of his life, to ensure he never spoke about what he'd found in that muddy crater. Harrison agreed to Ashford's terms, though it sat poorly with him. What choice did he have? But he made one condition. He wanted to know what they found when they investigated further. He wanted regular reports, even if they came through unofficial channels. Ashford agreed, perhaps recognizing that keeping Harrison partially informed would ensure his silence better than any threat. Over the following months, as Harrison shipped home to Virginia and attempted to resume something resembling a normal life, he received occasional letters from Whitmore. Never anything specific, never anything that could be considered classified, just friendly correspondence from one former comrade to another. But within the mundane details about the weather and mutual acquaintances, Harrison learned to read between the lines. The investigation was progressing. Names were being verified. Financial accounts were being traced. And what they were finding was worse than anyone had imagined. The network was older than they thought, with roots extending back decades before the war. It had manipulated diplomatic crises, influenced colonial policies, and played nations against each other with the skill of a master chess player. The assassination in Sarajevo had indeed been their work, but it was just the culmination of years of careful preparation, creating tensions that made war almost inevitable. And the network was still active. The first real breakthrough came in March of 1919, detailed in a letter from Whitmore that arrived hidden inside a package of books Harrison's mother had supposedly sent from a church charity. The major had tracked down a banker in Geneva named Klaus Reinhardt, one of the names prominently featured in Kovach's ledger. Reinhardt had been cooperative once presented with evidence of his involvement, perhaps because he understood that cooperation was his only path to avoiding a hangman's noose. What Reinhardt revealed changed everything they thought they knew. The network wasn't primarily about espionage for military advantage. That was secondary, almost incidental. The real purpose was economic manipulation on a scale that staggered the imagination. Reinhardt described a system where information was currency, more valuable than gold or territory. By knowing troop movements before generals finalized them, by understanding diplomatic negotiations before ambassadors entered the room, by having advance warning of technological developments before patents were filed, the network could position investments to profit enormously from every phase of the war. They shorted French bonds 2 days before major German offensives. They bought steel futures knowing which factories would receive massive government contracts. They invested in pharmaceutical companies just before chemical weapons created unprecedented demand for medical supplies. They purchased agricultural land in neutral countries weeks before food shortages drove prices skyward. Every tragedy of the war, every innovation born from desperate necessity, every shift in political fortune, they had turned it all into profit. And the money generated didn't simply enrich individuals. It funded the network's expansion, paying for more agents, bribing more officials, purchasing more influence. It was a self-perpetuating machine, growing stronger with each crisis it helped create. Reinhardt provided names, dozens of them, and those names led to others. By summer of 1919, the investigation had identified network members in 17 countries. But the deeper they went, the more disturbing the picture became. Many of those involved weren't motivated primarily by money. They were ideologues, believers in a philosophy that nation-states were obsolete, that the old order needed to be torn down completely before something new could be built. The war had been their tool, their battering ram against the pillars of civilization. Harrison received a telegram in August requesting his presence in Washington. No explanation, just a time and address in Georgetown. When he arrived at the specified location, a townhouse on a tree-lined street, he found Colonel Ashford waiting, along with 2 Americans Harrison didn't recognize. One was introduced as Mr. Thompson from the State Department, though Harrison suspected that was not his real name. The other was simply called the Director, and he never specified which agency he directed. "Gentlemen," the Director began without pleasantries, "we have a problem that goes beyond anything we initially anticipated." He gestured to a table covered with documents and photographs. "What began as an investigation into wartime espionage has uncovered something that threatens the stability of the post-war order. We're not just dealing with spies and profiteers anymore. We're dealing with a shadow government that spans continents." He picked up a photograph showing a group of well-dressed men standing on the steps of what appeared to be a Swiss chalet. This was taken in July of 1914, 1 month before the war began. We've identified 11 of the 15 men in this picture. 3 are now dead, killed during the war in ways that appeared accidental or coincidental. Of the 8 still living, 2 are members of Parliament in London. 1 is an advisor to the French Premier, 1 owns the largest steel consortium in Germany, and the others hold similar positions of influence. Harrison studied the photograph, noting the relaxed postures, the casual elegance. These were men comfortable with power, men who expected to be obeyed. What were they meeting about? According to Reinhardt and others we've questioned, they were finalizing plans for how the network would operate once hostilities began. They weren't trying to prevent the war, Captain Harrison. They were making sure it happened exactly as they wanted it to. Mr. Thompson from the State Department leaned forward. "We've traced financial connections between members of this network and several American corporations, companies that supplied both Allied and Central powers with various materials. Officially, we had trading restrictions and embargo policies. In practice, certain well-connected individuals found ways around those restrictions, selling to both sides and profiting handsomely." "Are you telling me," Harrison said slowly, "that American businessmen helped arm the Germans who were killing American soldiers?" The room fell silent. Finally, the Director spoke. "We're telling you that patriotism and loyalty meant nothing to these people. They recognized no flags, no borders, no allegiances beyond their own interests. And yes, some of them were American citizens. One of them was a major fundraiser for the president's campaign. Another is a respected philanthropist who's donated millions to universities and hospitals." "Jesus Christ," Harrison breathed. Ashford spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "It gets worse. We've found evidence that the network had plans to influence the peace negotiations at Versailles. They wanted to ensure the treaty was punitive enough to create long-term instability in Germany, setting the stage for future conflicts they could exploit. They didn't want lasting peace, Harrison. They wanted a 20-year armistice that would eventually lead to another war, another opportunity for profit and power. The implications crashed over Harrison like a wave. Everything we did, everyone who died, it was all manipulated, orchestrated, not orchestrated entirely, the Director said. Wars are too chaotic. involved too many variables for complete control. But influenced, guided, exploited, absolutely. They created conditions that made war likely, then profited from every consequence, and they're positioning themselves to do it again. "What do you want from me?" Harrison asked. The director pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "We're creating a special unit, operating outside normal military and intelligence structures. Its sole purpose is to hunt down every member of this network and neutralize them, not through public trials, which would create martyrs and alert others, through quiet removal from positions of influence, through financial pressure, through exposure of personal scandals that discredit them, through whatever means prove necessary and effective." "You're talking about assassination," Harrison said flatly. "I'm talking about protecting the Republic," the director replied, without hesitation. "These people are a cancer in the body politic. They've grown rich on the blood of millions. They're already planning their next moves, their next manipulations. We can either stop them now, quietly and effectively, or we can wait for the next war and watch it happen again." Harrison looked at the folder, but didn't open it. "And if I refuse? Then you go back to Virginia, raise your family, live your life, and try to forget everything you've learned. Someone else will do this work. But based on your service record, your intelligence, and your demonstrated integrity, we believe you're the right man to lead this unit. The choice is yours, Captain. Justice or willful ignorance." It wasn't really a choice at all, and they both knew it. Harrison took command of what was officially designated as the Historical Documentation Unit, a deliberately boring name that ensured no one asked questions. His team consisted of 12 hand-picked men, all veterans, all tested in combat, all capable of operating in the moral gray zones where this work required them to go. Major Whitmore was his second in command, bringing his analytical genius to the task of unraveling the network's structure. They worked out of a nondescript office building in Baltimore, away from Washington's political scrutiny. Their cover story was that they were compiling records of American military operations in Europe for future historical analysis. In reality, they were waging a different kind of war, one fought in bank vaults and boardrooms, in the private studies of powerful men, and the offices of corrupt officials. Their first major operation targeted a man named Charles Pemberton, a New York financier whose name appeared repeatedly in Kovacs' ledger. Pemberton had made a fortune during the war through carefully timed investments that seemed almost prophetic in their accuracy. He knew which companies would get contracts before the contracts were announced. He knew which currencies would strengthen or weaken before market forces became apparent. He knew, because he had access to information that should have been closely guarded state secrets. Harrison's team spent 3 months building a case against Pemberton. They documented his communications with known network members in Europe. They traced his financial transactions through multiple layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. They identified the government clerks and military officers who had fed him information, sometimes for money, sometimes through blackmail, sometimes simply because they believed in the network's ideology. When they had everything they needed, they didn't arrest Pemberton. Instead, they visited him late one night in his mansion overlooking the Hudson River. Harrison and Whitmore sat across from the financier in his library, surrounded by leather-bound books that Pemberton probably had never read, and laid out everything they knew. Pemberton was a smooth man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. He listened without visible emotion as Harrison detailed his crimes, occasionally sipping brandy from a crystal glass. When Harrison finished, Pemberton smiled. "Impressive detective work, gentlemen. Truly. But tell me, what exactly do you plan to do with this information? Arrest me? On what charges? Sedition? Treason?" He laughed softly. "You have evidence of financial transactions that might appear irregular but aren't technically illegal. You have correspondence that could be interpreted various ways. You have nothing that would stand up in a court of law, and we both know it. We're not interested in courts, Harrison said quietly. We're offering you a choice. You can cooperate fully, provide us with names and details about network operations, and accept exile to a country where your influence will be minimal. Or you can refuse, and we'll destroy you through other means. We'll leak information about your activities to your competitors, to the newspapers, to your business partners. We'll ensure that every door in American society closes to you. And if that's not sufficient, well, accidents happen, Mr. Pemberton. The war taught us many things about making accidents happen. The smile faded from Pemberton's face. You're threatening to murder an American citizen on American soil? I'm offering you a way to retire peacefully, Harrison replied. The alternative is that you become a problem that needs to be solved permanently. Your choice. Pemberton chose exile, perhaps recognizing that Harrison meant every word. Before he left for Argentina, he provided detailed testimony about network operations. He described meetings in Paris and Zurich, naming attendees and topics discussed. He explained how information was gathered, processed, and disseminated. He revealed financial structures that would take years to fully untangle, and he confirmed what Harrison had suspected, but hoped wasn't true. The network extended into the highest levels of multiple governments, including the American administration. Not the president himself, but people close to him. Advisors whose counsel helped shape policy. People who had ensured America entered the war at a time that maximized profit opportunities for network members. People who were now working to shape the peace in ways that would enable future exploitation. Armed with Pemberton's testimony and their own investigation, Harrison's unit moved against other network members. Some cooperated and accepted exile or forced retirement. Others fought back, using their influence and connections to create obstacles. 2 members of Harrison's team were killed in what were officially recorded as random street violence, though Harrison knew better. The network was fighting for its survival, and it had resources and ruthlessness to match his own. In Vienna, they tracked down a woman named Elena Markovich, who had been one of Kovac's primary contacts. Markovich was Serbian by birth, Austrian by circumstance, and she possessed an extraordinary talent for gathering secrets. She had worked as a translator at the Austrian Foreign Ministry during the war, with access to diplomatic cables and confidential correspondence. She had passed information to Kovac, who distributed it to network members who could profit from it. But when Harrison's team found her living under an assumed name in a small apartment near the Danube, they discovered she had kept her own insurance policy. A second satchel, similar to Kovac's, filled with documents that detailed operations Harrison hadn't known about, evidence of network involvement in the Russian Revolution, helping to fund Bolshevik activities because chaos in Russia served their interests, proof that they had manipulated the influenza pandemic response, deliberately creating supply shortages in certain regions to drive up prices for medical goods they controlled. Records of assassinations and disappearances across Europe, people who had gotten too close to discovering the truth. Markovich was terrified when they found her, convinced they had come to kill her. Instead, Harrison made her the same offer he'd made others: testimony in exchange for protection and a new life far from Europe. She agreed, and her information proved invaluable, opening new avenues of investigation and identifying network members previously unknown to them. By 1921, Harrison's unit had identified over 200 individuals connected to the network, though they estimated that was perhaps half the total membership. They had successfully removed about 30 from positions of influence through various means. They had disrupted financial operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had prevented at least 3 planned assassinations of political figures who were obstacles to network interests. But they were fighting a hydra. For every head they cut off, 2 more seemed to appear. The network adapted, becoming more cautious, more secretive. Communication methods changed. Financial transactions became even more convoluted. Members who felt threatened disappeared into places where American intelligence couldn't easily reach them. And then they found the documents that changed everything again. In a safe deposit box in a London bank, opened after its owner died in a car accident that Harrison's team suspected was staged. They found a leather journal filled with handwritten notes in code. It took Whitmore 3 weeks to crack the cipher, working with a mathematician from Princeton who had helped break German codes during the war. What they read in those decoded pages was almost impossible to believe. The network wasn't content with manipulation and profit. They had a long-term goal, a vision that extended decades into the future. They wanted to create what the journal called a rationalized world order, a system where national governments were weakened to the point of irrelevance, where economic power was concentrated in the hands of those wise enough and ruthless enough to wield it properly. They saw democracy as an obstacle, nationalism as a primitive emotion to be overcome, individual liberty as a dangerous indulgence that prevented efficient organization of society. The war had been a test, a demonstration of their capability. They had shown they could manipulate nations into conflict, profit from the chaos, and emerge stronger when the killing stopped. The journal outlined plans for future operations, economic depressions that would devastate the middle classes and concentrate wealth upward, political movements that would divide populations against themselves, making them easier to control, technologies that would enable unprecedented surveillance and social control. It read like the ravings of a madman, except that Harrison knew these weren't madmen. They were brilliant, patient, well-funded individuals who had already demonstrated their ability to shape world events. And they were playing a game that thought in terms of generations, not years. Harrison brought the decoded journal to Washington, meeting again with the director and Colonel Ashford. This time, 2 additional men were present. One was introduced as representing the British government at the highest levels. The other simply observed from the corner, never speaking, his face obscured in shadow despite the room's bright lighting. The director read through the decoded passages, his expression growing grimmer with each page. Finally, he set the journal down and removed his spectacles, rubbing his eyes with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. "Gentlemen, we're not equipped to fight this, not in the way it needs to be fought. This requires resources, coordination, and a level of secrecy that goes beyond anything we've attempted." "Then we give up?" Harrison asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "We let them win. We adapt," the British representative said, speaking for the first time. His accent was educated, upper class, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Captain Harrison, your work has been extraordinary. You've exposed a threat that most people don't believe exists and wouldn't understand if they did. But this journal makes clear that we're dealing with an enemy that thinks across decades, that has resources we can only guess at, that has already penetrated our institutions more deeply than we imagined. So what do you propose?" Harrison demanded. "We create something permanent," the director said. "Not a temporary unit that will be disbanded when funding runs out or political winds shift. A permanent organization operating with minimal oversight, focused exclusively on identifying and countering this threat. We recruit from multiple nations because this enemy respects no borders, and neither can we. We work in absolute secrecy because the moment they fully understand how much we know, they'll adapt in ways we can't predict." "You're talking about creating our own shadow government," Whitmore observed quietly. "I'm talking about creating a shield," the director replied. "Something that stands between their ambitions and the freedoms that millions died to preserve. Yes, it will operate in shadows. Yes, it will sometimes do things that would horrify ordinary citizens. But the alternative is allowing these people to continue unopposed, continuing to manipulate world events for their own purposes, eventually achieving their goal of a world where freedom is a forgotten dream." The man in the corner finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute authority. "It's already been decided. Captain Harrison, you will continue to lead operations against the network, but now with enhanced resources and international cooperation. Major Whitmore, you will establish an intelligence analysis center, coordinating information from multiple sources. Gentlemen from London and Paris, you will be our liaisons with British and French services. This meeting is to inform you of decisions already made, not to debate them." "And who decides what this organization does?" Harrison asked. "Who ensures we don't become exactly what we're fighting against?" "That," the shadowy figure said, "is the question you'll be asking yourself every day for the rest of your career. Welcome to the abyss, Captain. Try not to let it consume you." Over the next 5 years, Harrison built an organization that operated across continents, hunting network members with relentless efficiency. They worked with emerging intelligence services in multiple countries, shared information through secure channels, and developed techniques for identifying and tracking individuals who thought they had become invisible. They prevented coups in 2 Latin American countries, disrupted arms smuggling operations in the Balkans, and stopped what would have been a catastrophic financial manipulation that could have triggered another global depression. But the network fought back. Harrison lost more men, good men who believed they were protecting something worth dying for. His marriage, never strong after his return from war, collapsed under the strain of a life he couldn't explain to his wife. He aged rapidly, the stress carving lines in his face and turning his hair prematurely gray. He became what he had sworn never to become. A man who could order deaths without losing sleep, who could justify almost anything in service of a greater good he sometimes doubted actually existed. And through it all, he knew they were only slowing the network, not defeating it. For every member they identified and neutralized, others emerged. The organization adapted, evolved, learned from its mistakes. It recruited new members from each generation, people seduced by promises of power or convinced by ideological arguments that the old order deserved to fall. In December of 1925, Harrison received a package at his office in Baltimore. No return address, just his name written in elegant script on expensive paper. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed Harrison himself, taken recently based on how worn he looked. He was entering his office building, unaware of the camera. The quality was professional, the angle perfect. Someone had been watching him, close enough to get that shot, patient enough to wait for the right moment. The note was brief. "You've fought well, Captain Harrison. You've been a worthy adversary, but you must understand by now that this is a war you cannot win. We are patient. We are many. We are inevitable. Your children will live in the world we create, whether you like it or not. Perhaps it's time to stop fighting and start accepting." It was unsigned, but Harrison recognized it for what it was, not a threat, but an invitation. They wanted him to give up, to accept defeat, to understand that resistance was futile. And part of him, the part that was exhausted and disillusioned and weary of moral compromises, wanted to accept that message. But he thought of the young soldiers he had led in France, boys who had believed they were fighting for something better. He thought of Private Coleman, who had found that damned Satchel, and whose simple act of honesty had started all of this. He thought of his own children, who he barely knew anymore, but who deserved a world where their futures weren't controlled by shadowy manipulators. And he knew he couldn't stop, no matter how futile it seemed. Harrison worked for another 12 years, until a heart attack forced his retirement in 1937. By then, the organization he had built had grown into something he barely recognized, a vast intelligence apparatus with tentacles reaching into governments, corporations, and institutions worldwide. It had become, in some ways, a mirror image of the network it fought, operating by similar rules, using similar methods, justifying everything in the name of a greater good. His successor, a cold-eyed man named Morrison, who had never met a moral boundary he couldn't cross, thanked Harrison for his service and suggested he might want to spend his retirement somewhere quiet, far from Washington and Baltimore. Somewhere he wouldn't be tempted to speak about things better left unspoken. Harrison moved to a small town in Montana, as far from the centers of power as he could get. He lived simply, kept to himself, and tried to forget everything he had done and learned. But he couldn't forget. Not really. He read newspapers and recognized patterns in world events, saw the network's fingerprints in economic crises and political upheavals. He watched as Europe slid toward another war, and knew that somewhere members of the network were positioning themselves to profit from the coming catastrophe. He died in 1943, officially from complications of his old heart condition, unofficially from the weight of knowledge that had crushed his spirit long before it stopped his heart. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a decorated veteran of the Great War, who had lived a quiet retirement in Montana. No mention of the years in Baltimore, the organization he had built, the secret war he had fought. The only person who attended his funeral besides the local minister was Theodore Whitmore, now a silver-haired academic who officially taught history at Georgetown, but unofficially continued coordinating intelligence operations from behind his professor's desk. After the brief ceremony, Whitmore stood alone at the grave, holding the original leather satchel that Coleman had found in that muddy crater so many years ago. He never stopped believing. Whitmore said quietly, to no one in particular, he never accepted that the fight was unwinnable. Maybe that made him a fool. Or maybe it made him the best of us. Whitmore buried the satchel that night in a location he never revealed, believing some secrets were better lost than preserved. But he kept photocopies of its contents, locked in a safe that would eventually pass to his successors in the organization that Harrison had built. And the network? It continued, as it always had. Members died and were replaced. Methods evolved with technology. The goals remained constant: control through chaos, profit through manipulation, power through patience. By the 1940s, as the world burned in another global conflict, network members occupied positions in governments, corporations, and institutions across the globe. But so did members of Harrison's organization, now with no official name but known among initiates simply as the Counter. The secret war continued in shadows, unknown to the millions whose lives and futures hung in the balance. Victories were measured not in territory gained, but in disasters prevented, in manipulations disrupted, in the slow, grinding work of holding back an enemy that never showed its face, but never stopped advancing. Today, if you know where to look and have access to the right archives, you can find Harrison's name in classified documents, always footnoted, never explained in detail. You can trace the evolution of the organization he built, how it adapted to Cold War realities, how it incorporated new technologies and expanded into cyber warfare and economic intelligence. You can see how the Counter and the network continue their shadow conflict, fighting battles that most people never know happened, shaping a world that believes it's governed by the decisions of elected officials and free markets. And if you're very lucky, or very unlucky depending on your perspective, you might encounter someone who knows the truth, someone who has seen the evidence, who understands that beneath the surface of ordinary life, powerful forces work to control humanity's destiny. Someone who, like Harrison, understands that the only thing preventing those forces from total victory is the eternal vigilance of those willing to fight in the darkness. The satchel that Private Coleman found that November morning in 1918 contained more than documents. It contained proof that the world is not what it seems, that powerful individuals work tirelessly to manipulate events for their own benefit, that the price of freedom is not just the blood of soldiers in battle, but the silent sacrifice of those who fight enemies most people don't believe exist. And somewhere, in a vault, whose location is known to only a handful of living people, photocopies of those documents still exist. Insurance, perhaps. Proof, certainly. A reminder that the war Harrison fought never ended, that it continues today in boardrooms and government offices, in financial centers and technology companies, wherever power concentrates and ambition corrupts. The question isn't whether the network still exists. The question is whether the counter still has the strength, the resources, and the will to keep fighting a war that has no end, only an endless series of battles where victory means maintaining a status quo that most people take for granted. Private James Coleman never spoke about what he found that day. He returned to Oklahoma, married his childhood sweetheart, raised 4 children, and lived to see his grandchildren grow. He died in 1972, taking his silence to the grave, never knowing that his simple act of reporting what he'd found had sparked a war that still rages today. But sometimes, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Coleman would think about that leather satchel, about the dead man in the muddy crater, about Captain Harrison's intensity when he'd ordered silence. And he would wonder what had been in those documents, what secrets had been worth such deadly seriousness. He never found out, but some part of him always suspected that he had stumbled onto something that changed the course of history in ways no one would ever publicly acknowledge. He was right. The leather satchel, that innocent-looking pouch that had survived fire and blood and the chaos of war's final hours, had contained the key to understanding how the world really works. Not the fairy tale version taught in schools, where nations act rationally and leaders serve their people and justice eventually prevails, but the real version, where shadowy networks manipulate events across generations, where profit matters more than patriotism, where the lives of millions are chess pieces in games played by people who see themselves as beyond ordinary morality. And if you're watching this video, if you've listened to this story all the way through, then you now know something that most people never learn. You know that the world is not governed solely by the leaders we see, that powerful forces work in shadows, that the freedom we take for granted is constantly under assault by those who see it as an obstacle to their vision of perfect control. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. You can dismiss it as conspiracy theory, as paranoid fantasy, as entertainment with no basis in reality. That would be the comfortable choice, the easy path. Or you can open your eyes to patterns in world events, can question narratives that seem too convenient, can recognize that power always seeks more power, and that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. But whatever you choose, remember this: there are people right now working in silence to protect freedoms you didn't know were threatened. They follow in Harrison's footsteps, fighting battles they can never discuss, making sacrifices no one will ever acknowledge. They stand between you and forces that would reshape the world into something unrecognizable. And on the other side, the network continues its work, patient, adaptable, convinced that their vision of a rationalized world order is not just preferable, but inevitable. They recruit new members, develop new strategies, position themselves for opportunities that may not come for decades but will eventually arrive. The war continues. It never stopped. It never will, as long as some humans seek power over others, as long as greed outweighs conscience, as long as the many remain blind to the machinations of the few. In these dark times, when it seems like the forces of evil are everywhere, remember that light always defeats darkness. Remember that there is one truth that no network can manipulate, no conspiracy can suppress, no human power can overcome. The truth of Jesus Christ, who taught us to love our enemies, to seek justice for the oppressed, to stand firm against evil in all its forms. Put your faith not in human institutions, but in the God who created you, who loves you, who sent his Son to redeem you from sin and death. Follow Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. In him, You will find the strength to face whatever darkness this world contains, the wisdom to recognize evil in all its disguises, and the peace that comes from knowing that ultimate victory belongs not to the manipulators and schemers, but to the one who judges all hearts, and will one day make all things right. The battle between light and darkness is as old as creation itself, but you don't have to fight it alone. Stand with God, stand with Christ, and know that no matter how powerful the networks of this world may seem, they are nothing before the power of the Almighty. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in these troubled times, and may you always remember that the truth, once known, carries with it the responsibility to resist the lie, no matter how powerful those telling it may be.